James Harrison drummed his fingers against the leather steering wheel of his Tesla Model S, the air conditioning battling valiantly against the sweltering July heat. The digital dashboard displayed an error message he'd never seen before, and the car had gradually slowed to a complete stop on a tree-lined street in a neighborhood he rarely visited. Perfect. Just perfect, he muttered, loosening his custom-tailored tie. His phone indicated he was still 15 minutes away from the venture capital meeting he was already running late for. At 34, James had built Connectify, a social networking app for professionals, into a $300 million company, but he still felt the need to personally court new investors. He tried restarting the car twice before accepting defeat. After calling his assistant, Melissa, to reschedule the meeting, he stepped out into the heat, his Italian loafers meeting unfamiliar pavement. The sun immediately assaulted his face, causing beads of sweat to form along his forehead. James glanced around, spotting a small convenience store about a block away, the only business in sight that appeared to be open. "Guess I'll call for help inside," he said to himself, squinting against the glare as he locked his car and began walking. The bell above the door jingled as he entered Martinez Mini-Mart, the rush of cool air a welcome relief. The store was modest but clean, with neatly organized shelves and a surprisingly diverse selection of products. A radio played softly in the background, some indie song he didn't recognize. "Be right with you," called a female voice from behind a shelf. James wandered toward the refrigerated section, suddenly aware of his thirst. He selected a bottle of artesian water, the kind he usually had delivered to his office by the case. As he approached the counter, he noticed her for the first time. The cashier was around his age, maybe a few years younger, with dark, curly hair pulled into a messy bun. Several wispy strands had escaped to frame her face. She wore a simple blue polo shirt with a name tag that read Sophie, and seemed deeply focused on a thick textbook splayed open beside the register. "Organic Chemistry?" James read the title aloud, causing Sophie to look up. Her eyes were a warm brown, framed by lashes that didn't need the mascara she wore. For a brief moment, James forgot why he'd come in. "Sorry," she said, marking her place with a highlighter before closing the book. "Finals week. I'm squeezing in study time wherever I can." She smiled, a genuine smile that reached her eyes. "Just the water today?" "Yes," James replied, then remembered his predicament. "Actually, my car broke down outside. Could I use your phone? My cell has no service here for some reason." Sophie raised an eyebrow. "No service? That's weird. Most carriers work fine around here." She glanced at his suit, his watch, his carefully styled hair. "Though I'm guessing you're not around here very often." There was something in her tone, not quite judgmental, but observant, that made James feel suddenly self-conscious. "It's a Tesla," he explained, immediately regretting how pretentious it sounded. "They can be temperamental." Sophie's lips quirked into a half-smile. "Ah, high maintenance. Got it." She pushed an old-fashioned corded phone across the counter. "Knock yourself out," James called his premium roadside assistance service, learning it would be at least an hour before they could reach him. After hanging up, he sighed and pulled out his wallet to pay for the water. "That'll be $2.25, Sophie said, watching as he extracted a $100 bill, the smallest he had. "Sorry, I don't have anything smaller," he said, feeling strangely embarrassed. Sophie rolled her eyes but took the bill. As she counted out his change, James noticed her hands, slender fingers with short, practical nails, a small burn scar on her right index finger. "You're really studying organic chemistry?" he asked, genuinely curious. The subject had been his nemesis during his brief pre-business school days. "Yep, pre-med. Third attempt at this course, actually." She handed him his change with a self-deprecating smile. "Turns out working 3 jobs doesn't leave much time for studying the Krebs cycle." "3 jobs?" James couldn't hide his surprise. "This one belongs to my parents. I help out when I can. Then there's waiting tables at Rosario's on weekends, and I do some tutoring for high school kids." She shrugged. Med school isn't going to pay for itself. James felt a twinge of something unfamiliar, a mixture of admiration and discomfort. He'd had a full scholarship to Stanford, followed by a hefty investment from his father to start his business. "That's impressive," he said finally. "That's survival," she corrected, though not unkindly. "So, Mr. Tesla, you're stuck here for an hour?" "Looks that way." "And it's James Harrison. Sophie Martinez," she replied, gesturing to her name tag with a playful duh expression. An awkward silence fell between them, broken only when the bell above the door announced another customer, an elderly man who greeted Sophie by name and headed straight for the coffee machine. "Regular customer?" James asked, after the man had left with his coffee and newspaper. "Mr. Abernathy comes in every day at exactly 2:15 for the same order," Sophie explained. "His wife died 3 years ago, and I think he's mostly looking for conversation." James was struck by how she spoke about the man, with genuine affection rather than the customer service voice he was accustomed to hearing. "You know all your customers that well?" "Most of them. That's the thing about a neighborhood store. It's not just transactions, it's community." She reopened her textbook, signaling that she needed to return to studying. James took the hint and sipped his water, wandering around the store to kill time. He found himself observing Sophie as she alternated between highlighting passages in her book and helping the occasional customer. Each person received the same warm attention, the same genuine interest in their lives. His phone chimed with a message from Melissa about rescheduling his meeting, pulling him back to his own world of deadlines and deals. As he typed a response, he overheard Sophie speaking to someone in rapid Spanish, an older woman who seemed distressed. After the woman left, James approached the counter again. "Everything okay?" Sophie sighed. "Mrs. Diaz's son lost his job at the factory. She's worried about making rent next month." She tapped her pencil against the counter. "I told her I'd pick up some extra tutoring hours and pass them her way." "That's very kind of you," James said, meaning it. Sophie looked at him with a bemused expression. "It's not kindness when it's your community, it's just what you do." She tilted her head. "I'm guessing that's not how things work in Tesla land." There was no malice in her question, just genuine curiosity, but James felt defensive nonetheless. "My company employs over 200 people. We provide excellent benefits, including healthcare and childcare subsidies." "Impressive," Sophie said, echoing his earlier comment. "Corporate responsibility is important." Before James could respond, his phone rang with the roadside assistance service, informing him they'd arrived earlier than expected. "My ride's here," he said, gathering his things. "Thanks for the water and the phone." "Any time," Sophie replied, already turning back to her book. "Good luck with your car." James paused at the door, looking back at her, head bent over her textbook, pen tapping against her lip in concentration. There was something compelling about her focus, her groundedness in this small corner of the world. "Actually," he found himself saying, "I never got around to eating lunch. Is there a good place around here?" Sophie looked up, surprise flickering across her face. "Depends on what you consider good. There's Emilio's Taqueria 2 blocks down, best carnitas in the city, though the health department might have a different opinion." James laughed, a genuine laugh that surprised even himself. "Sounds perfect. Would you want to join me? If you can take a break, that is." The invitation hung in the air between them. Sophie's expression shifted from surprise to wariness to something like curiosity. "I can't leave the store," she said finally. "My cousin Miguel was supposed to cover for me an hour ago, but he's running late." "As usual." "Right, of course," James said, feeling uncharacteristically awkward. "Another time, perhaps." "Perhaps," Sophie echoed, though her tone suggested she didn't think it likely. Just then the bell jingled again, and a young man burst in, all energy and apologies. "So sorry, Sophie. The bus was late, and then this guy with a chicken. You wouldn't believe." "Save it, Miguel," Sophie interrupted, though her irritation seemed affectionate. Just take over so I can go to lunch. My textbook's under the counter if it gets quiet. She grabbed her purse from beneath the register and came around the counter, surprising James with how petite she was, at least a foot shorter than his 6'2" frame. "Still hungry?" she asked him with a challenging smile. "Fair warning, Emilio doesn't take hundreds." James felt an unexpected smile spread across his face. "I think I can scrounge up some smaller bills." As they stepped out into the sunshine, James felt strangely disoriented, as if he'd wandered into someone else's life. His Tesla waited by the curb, the technician explaining something about a software glitch, but James found himself only half listening. Sophie stood slightly apart, her face tilted toward the sun, seeming perfectly comfortable in her own skin in a way that made James's carefully constructed persona feel suddenly heavy. "All set, Mr. Harrison," the technician said, handing back his keys. "Thank you," James replied automatically, then turned to Sophie. "So about that lunch." She looked at the Tesla, then back at him, a mixture of amusement and wariness in her expression. "You know what? I think I'll take a rain check. Your world is up and running again." She gestured to his car. "You should get back to it." James felt a strange disappointment settle in his chest. "Are you sure? It's just lunch." "It's never just lunch," Sophie replied with a knowing smile. "Besides, I have studying to do." She took a step back. "It was nice meeting you, James Harrison." Before he could respond, she turned and walked back toward the store, her curly hair catching the sunlight. James stood there for a moment longer than necessary, feeling as though he'd failed some test he hadn't known he was taking. Finally, he got into his car, the luxury interior suddenly seeming overly complicated. As he pulled away from the curb, he glanced in his rearview mirror. Sophie had paused at the store entrance, watching his departure. Their eyes met briefly in the reflection before she disappeared inside. James drove back to his familiar world of glass skyscrapers and business meetings, but his mind kept returning to a small convenience store and a woman with a textbook and 3 jobs who somehow seemed richer than he felt most days. He was halfway to his office when he realized he was still smiling. 3 days after the Tesla incident, James found himself thinking about Sophie during a tedious board meeting. Her authenticity had left an impression he couldn't shake. Making an impulsive decision, he told his driver to take a detour on the way home. When James walked into Martinez mini-mart again, Sophie wasn't there. Instead, an older man with a similar warm smile stood behind the counter. "Can I help you find something?" the man asked. "I was looking for Sophie, actually," James admitted. The man's eyebrows rose slightly. "My daughter. She's at her other job tonight, Rosario's on 5th Street. James thanked him and left, debating with himself for 20 minutes before directing his driver to the restaurant. Rosario's was a family-owned Italian place with checkered tablecloths and photos of Rome on the walls. The hostess seated him at a small table in Sophie's section. When Sophie approached with water and menus, she stopped mid-stride. "Tesla guy," she said, surprise evident in her voice. "This is, unexpected." "James," he corrected with a smile. "And yes, I suppose it is. Are you following me?" The question was direct, but her tone was more curious than accusatory. "I went to the store," James admitted. "Your father told me where to find you." Sophie sighed. "Of course he did. Dad never misses a chance to send customers my way." She studied him. "Though something tells me you're not here for the carbonara." "I hear it's excellent," James replied with a small smile. "But I was hoping to cash in that rain check for lunch." Sophie glanced around the half-empty restaurant. "I'm working until 11. "I can wait," James said, surprising himself with his persistence. Sophie's expression softened slightly. "Why?" The simple question caught him off guard. In his world, people rarely asked for his motivations. They assumed ambition, power, or profit. "Because I'd like to get to know you," he answered honestly. "You're different." "Different from what?" "From everyone in my world." Sophie considered this, then shrugged. "I get off at 11. There's a diner around the corner that's open late. Andy's. Meet me there if you want." She handed him a menu. Until then, the carbonara really is excellent. James enjoyed a surprisingly good meal, leaving Sophie a tip that exceeded the bill itself. At 11:15, he walked into Andy's Diner, a retro establishment with red vinyl booths and a jukebox playing oldies. Sophie was already there, her work clothes exchanged for jeans and a worn university sweatshirt, her hair loose around her shoulders. She looked tired but somehow more herself. "You actually came," she said, as he slid into the booth across from her. "I said I would." People say a lot of things. A waitress brought coffee without being asked, clearly familiar with Sophie. 3 jobs and night classes, James mused. When do you sleep? Sleep is for people who don't have student loans, Sophie replied, but her smile took the edge off her words. So, James Harrison, why is a tech millionaire slumming it in a diner at midnight? James looked surprised. You Googled me? Of course I did. Girls got to be careful these days. She sipped her coffee. Connectify, 34 years old, Stanford grad, net worth approximately 300 million. The internet makes privacy a thing of the past, James said, feeling strangely exposed. Says the man whose app collects user data, Sophie countered with a raised eyebrow. Their conversation flowed surprisingly easily after that, debating technology ethics, sharing stories from their vastly different childhoods, discovering a mutual love for obscure documentaries. Despite their differences, James found himself more engaged than he'd been on any recent date with women from his social circle. As the night grew later, Sophie explained her dream of becoming a doctor serving underprivileged communities. My grandmother died because she couldn't afford proper health care, she explained quietly. I don't want that happening to anyone else's family. James felt humbled by her purpose, so much clearer than his own ambition-driven path. When they finally left the diner at 2 a.m, James offered her a ride home. Thanks, but I've got my bike, Sophie said, pointing to an old bicycle chained nearby. At this hour, let me drive you, please. Sophie hesitated, then nodded. Okay, but no judging my neighborhood. Her apartment was in a run-down building in a working-class area. As they pulled up, James noticed her watching his reaction carefully. Thank you for tonight, he said sincerely. I'd like to see you again. Sophie studied him for a long moment. Why? We're from different worlds, James. Maybe that's exactly why. She seemed to make a decision. I have Thursdays off, from all 3 jobs. James smiled. Thursday it is. As he drove away, watching her enter her building, James realized he was looking forward to Thursday more than the major investor meeting he had the next day. Something was shifting in his carefully ordered life, and for once he didn't feel the need to control it. Thursday arrived with anticipation that surprised James. He'd suggested picking Sophie up at 7, but she had countered with meeting at a public park at 6. While there's still daylight, she'd texted with a winking emoji that somehow both amused and challenged him. James arrived 15 minutes early, feeling strangely nervous as he sat on a bench near the park's central fountain. He'd deliberately dressed down in jeans and a casual button-up, though his idea of casual still involved designer labels. He spotted her before she saw him, walking with a relaxed confidence, wearing a simple sundress and sandals, her curly hair bouncing with each step. No designer labels, no carefully crafted image, yet she commanded his attention completely. You're early, Sophie said as she approached, a teasing smile playing on her lips. So are you, James countered, standing to greet her. Habit from working multiple jobs. Early is on time is late. She gestured to a paper bag in her hand. I brought dinner. Hope you like empanadas. James raised an eyebrow. I made reservations at Ariana's. The upscale restaurant had required calling in a favor to secure a table on short notice. Sophie's expression shifted subtly. Fancy, but I promised my mum I'd try out her new recipe. She's thinking of adding them to the store's hot food section. She held up the bag. Besides, eating outside on a perfect evening beats stuffy restaurants any day. James hesitated, then nodded. Lead the way. They found a quiet spot beneath a large oak tree, where Sophie spread out a simple blanket she'd brought in her tote bag. As they sat, James noticed a young couple nearby having a similar picnic, though theirs involved wine and cheese rather than homemade empanadas. "So," Sophie said, unwrapping the food, "cancel those reservations with a quick text and then phones away for the evening. Deal?" James complied, though the thought of being unreachable for hours made him slightly uneasy. His phone buzzed 3 times in quick succession as he was about to put it away. "Everything okay?" Sophie asked, noting his expression. "Just work. It can wait." He silenced the phone and placed it in his pocket. Sophie handed him an empanada wrapped in parchment paper. "My mom's speciality, spiced beef with olives and raisins, family recipe from Chile." James took a bite and was genuinely surprised by the explosion of flavors. "This is incredible," he said, meaning it. "I know," Sophie grinned. "Mom could be running her own restaurant, but she says the store lets her feed the neighborhood her way." As they ate, Sophie shared stories about the neighborhood characters who frequented the store. The retired professor who read poetry to anyone who would listen, the twins who saved their allowance for weeks to buy their mother a birthday cake, the elderly couple who came in every anniversary to buy the same candy they'd shared on their first date. "You really love that place," James observed. "It's not just a store. It's where I grew up, where I learned math by counting change, where I saw my parents work impossible hours so I could have opportunities they never did." Her eyes held a pride that made James think differently about the modest convenience store. "What about you?" Sophie asked. "What's it like running a company that connects millions of people?" James found himself sharing the less polished side of his success, the sleepless nights, the weight of responsibility for his employees, the loneliness that sometimes came with leadership. "Most people just see the end result," he admitted. "They don't see the doubt, the failures along the way." "Failures? The great James Harrison has failed at things?" Sophie teased. "More than I like to admit," he laughed. "My first app was a dating service that matched people based on their grocery shopping habits. Total disaster." "That actually sounds interesting. What happened?" "Turns out people lie about eating kale much more than you'd expect." Their laughter felt easy, natural. As the sun began to set, casting a golden glow across the park, James realized he hadn't checked his phone once. The constant urgency that typically filled his days had temporarily receded, replaced by a simple presence he rarely experienced. After dinner, they walked through the park, stopping to listen to a street musician playing guitar. When the musician began a familiar melody, Sophie's face lit up. "I love this song!" she exclaimed. Before James could respond, she dropped a $5 bill in the musician's case and pulled James toward an open space where several other couples were dancing. "I don't really dance," James protested weakly. "Everyone dances," Sophie countered. "Some just need permission." She placed one of his hands on her waist and took the other in hers. "Follow my lead." James felt awkward at first, too conscious of the correct steps. But Sophie's carefree movement was contagious. Soon, he found himself relaxing, spinning her around and pulling her close again, enjoying the simple pleasure of movement without purpose or efficiency. As the evening deepened, they found themselves at a small ice cream shop Sophie declared had the best pistachio in the city. Sitting at a wrought iron table outside, James watched Sophie lick her ice cream cone with unabashed enjoyment. "You're staring," she noted, looking up at him. "You're beautiful," he replied simply. A slight blush colored her cheeks, and for a moment she seemed at a loss for words. A rare occurrence, he was learning. "Smooth talker," she finally said, but her eyes held a warmth that hadn't been there before. As they finished their ice cream, a group of rowdy teenagers passed by, one of them accidentally bumping Sophie's arm, causing her cone to smear across her chin. "Oh, I'm so sorry, miss." The mortified teen apologized. Sophie laughed, wiping at her face with a napkin. "No harm done." James was struck by how easily she let the moment pass. No irritation, no making the teen feel worse than he already did. In his world, much smaller inconveniences often resulted in demands to speak to managers or thinly veiled threats of lawsuits. After the ice cream, James walked Sophie to the bus stop, despite his repeated offers to drive her home. "I take the bus every day," she insisted. "It's how real people get around." "Are you suggesting I'm not real?" James asked with mock offense. "Your world is curated," Sophie replied thoughtfully. "Private cars, exclusive restaurants, people who say yes to everything you want. There's a buffer between you and the everyday friction of life." James wanted to argue, but found he couldn't. She wasn't wrong. As they waited for the bus, a light rain began to fall. James automatically reached for his phone to call his driver, but Sophie caught his hand. "It's just water," she said softly. "It won't melt you." She tilted her face upward, letting the raindrops fall on her closed eyelids, a small smile playing on her lips. James found himself captivated by her complete presence in the moment. When the bus arrived, Sophie turned to him. "I had a really good time tonight." "Me too," James said, surprised by how true it was. "When can I see you again?" Sophie hesitated. "James, I like you. More than I expected to, but I'm not sure this makes sense. Our lives are completely different. Maybe different is exactly what we both need," he replied. The bus driver cleared his throat impatiently. Sophie glanced at the open doors, then back at James. Making a sudden decision, she stood on her tiptoes and kissed him, a quick, soft touch of her lips against his that ended almost before he registered what was happening. "Good night, James," she whispered, then climbed aboard the bus. James stood in the rain long after the bus had disappeared from view, touching his lips where the warmth of hers lingered. His phone buzzed again, with mounting notifications, but for once they seemed unimportant compared to the simple memory of a kiss in the rain. Walking back to where he'd parked, James realized that in just one evening, Sophie had shown him more of the city he'd lived in for years than he'd ever explored on his own. His carefully controlled life suddenly seemed smaller somehow, more limited than he'd ever noticed before. As he drove home to his penthouse apartment, the raindrops on his windshield reminded him of Sophie's upturned face, finding joy in something he would have normally considered an inconvenience. For the first time in years, James felt like he was waking up to possibilities beyond the next deal, the next milestone, the next achievement. There was a whole city out there, a whole life. He'd been too busy to notice. 2 weeks after their date in the park, James and Sophie had fallen into an unexpected rhythm. Despite their conflicting schedules, they'd managed to carve out moments together, quick lunches near the hospital where Sophie volunteered, late-night conversations after her shifts at Rosario's, and one memorable afternoon when James had shocked his executive team by cancelling meetings to help Sophie study for her organic chemistry final. Today, James stood in the elevator of his company's headquarters, checking his watch impatiently. Sophie's exam had ended 30 minutes ago, and he was eager to hear how it went. When his phone finally buzzed with her call, he answered immediately. "Well?" he asked without preamble. "I passed." Sophie's voice came through, breathless with excitement. 92%, James. After failing twice before. "I knew you could do it," he said, grinning widely enough to earn curious glances from others in the elevator. "This calls for a celebration." "I was thinking the same thing," Sophie replied. "My parents are throwing a small party at the store tonight. Nothing fancy, just family, some neighbors, lots of food." She paused. "I'd like you to come, meet everyone properly." James felt a flutter of nervousness. "Your family wants to meet me. Well, my dad technically already met you when you came looking for me." Sophie laughed. "But yes, fair warning, my mother will interrogate you, my grandmother will try to feed you until you explode, and my cousins will make inappropriate jokes." "Sounds terrifying," James said, but he was smiling. "What time?" 7. "And James, no suits, no expensive gifts, just you." After hanging up, James realized the elevator had reached his floor, but he remained standing there, doors open, lost in thought. Meeting Sophie's family felt significant, a crossing of worlds he hadn't anticipated when he'd first walked into that convenience store. "Mr. Harrison, is everything okay?" His assistant Melissa stood in the doorway of the elevator, looking concerned. "Everything's fine," he replied, stepping out. "Better than fine, actually. I need to leave early today. But you're 6 o'clock with the Japanese investors. Reschedule it. Family emergency." The words felt strange in his mouth. James couldn't remember the last time he'd prioritized personal matters over business. That evening, James parked his car. He'd opted for his less ostentatious Audi rather than the Tesla, a block away from Martinez Minimart. Through the windows, he could see the store transformed. Streamers hung from the ceiling. Tables had been pushed together and covered with colorful cloths, and at least 20 people were crowded inside, talking animatedly over what appeared to be an impressive spread of food. For a moment, James hesitated. He'd brought a small gift, despite Sophie's instructions, a vintage chemistry textbook he'd found at a bookstore that afternoon, complete with handwritten notes from a student in the 1970s. He hoped it struck the right balance between thoughtful and understated. Before he could overthink further, the door opened and Sophie emerged, scanning the street until she spotted him. Her face broke into a radiant smile that instantly calmed his nerves. "You came," she said, walking toward him. "I said I would." It had become their small ritual, his promise, her acknowledgement of trust fulfilled. Sophie looked different tonight, more relaxed, her hair loose around her shoulders, wearing a simple yellow dress that made her skin glow. She took his hand, squeezing it gently. "Ready to meet the Martinez clan?" "As ready as I'll ever be," James replied honestly. Inside, the store had been transformed into a warm, lively gathering space. The cash register was now a beverage station, shelving units had been pushed aside to make room for tables, and the normally fluorescent lighting had been softened with string lights. Sophie's father spotted them first, raising his glass in greeting before making his way over. Up close, James could see where Sophie got her expressive eyes. "So you're the Tesla man," Mr. Martinez said, extending his hand. "Eduardo Martinez." "James Harrison," he replied, shaking the offered hand. "Thank you for having me, sir." "Any friend of Sophie's is welcome here," Eduardo said, though his appraising look suggested he knew James was more than just a friend. "Come, meet my wife. She's been very curious about you." Mrs. Martinez was a petite woman with Sophie's curls and an air of quiet authority. She wiped her hands on her apron before embracing James warmly, a gesture that caught him off guard, but wasn't unwelcome. "So you're the reason my daughter has been smiling so much lately," she said, studying him openly. "And you helped her with her studies?" "Mom," Sophie protested. "He tutored organic chemistry at Stanford," Mrs. Martinez continued, clearly having done her research. "Very impressive." The evening progressed in a whirlwind of introductions. Cousins, aunts, uncles, neighbors, and friends, all greeting James with varying degrees of curiosity and warmth. He met Miguel, Sophie's chronically late cousin, Rosa, her childhood best friend who now taught kindergarten, and most intimidatingly, Abuela Elena, the family matriarch who spoke limited English, but communicated her approval or disapproval quite clearly through facial expressions. "She likes you," Sophie whispered, after her grandmother had patted James's cheek and pressed a third plate of food into his hands. "She doesn't usually feed strangers." "I'm honored," James replied, genuinely touched by the acceptance. As the night wore on, James found himself relaxing into the unfamiliar environment. He joined a heated debate about baseball with Sophie's uncles, learned a traditional family card game from her cousins, and even attempted a few phrases in Spanish that earned appreciative nods from Abuela Elena. The contrast with his usual social gatherings was stark. There were no business cards exchanged, no subtle probing about net worth or connections, no strategic conversations designed to advance agendas. People simply talked about their lives, their children, their hopes and frustrations, with an openness that was both refreshing and slightly disorienting. At one point, James found himself alone with Eduardo near the makeshift drink station. "You care for my daughter," Eduardo said. It wasn't a question. "I do," James answered honestly. Very much. Eduardo nodded slowly. Sophie has always walked her own path, strong-willed since she was little. He glanced across the room where Sophie was laughing with her cousins. But she carries many responsibilities, her studies, her work here, her dreams of becoming a doctor. I admire her determination, James said. Determination, yes, but also burden. Eduardo looked at James directly. In our community we understand struggle. We support each other. But your world, he paused, choosing his words carefully. Your world sees struggle differently. James considered this. I can't pretend to understand everything Sophie has gone through, but I want to learn. Eduardo seemed satisfied with this answer. Good. That's a start. He clapped James on the shoulder. Now come, try my wife's flan. It's her specialty. Later, Sophie found James in a corner, deep in conversation with Rosa about educational inequality in the city's school system. She looked pleased to see them getting along. Having fun? She asked, sliding an arm around his waist. Your family is amazing, James said sincerely. Everyone has been so welcoming. They can tell you're important to me, Sophie replied, a simple admission that made his heart skip. As the party began to wind down, Sophie's mother approached with a container of leftovers. For you to take home, she insisted, pressing it into James's hands. No arguments. Thank you, Mrs. Martinez. Everything was delicious. Eleanor, she corrected. And you must come for Sunday dinner next week, 2 o'clock. Sophie will give you the address. Before James could respond, she had moved on to say goodbye to other guests, leaving no room for refusal. Did I just get commanded to Sunday dinner? James asked, amused. Welcome to the Martinez family, Sophie laughed. When my mother decides you're coming to dinner, you're coming to dinner. Outside, the night had cooled, and stars were visible despite the city lights. James and Sophie walked slowly toward his car, neither eager for the evening to end. Thank you for coming tonight, Sophie said. I know it wasn't your usual scene. It was perfect, James replied. Your family is wonderful. They're a lot, I know. Loud, opinionated, always in each other's business. They love each other. James interrupted gently. It's obvious in everything they do. Sophie studied him. What about your family? You never talk about them. James hesitated. There's not much to tell. My parents divorced when I was 12. My father remarried, moved to Europe. My mother lives in Connecticut now with her third husband. We exchange birthday cards, occasional phone calls. No siblings. A half-sister from my father's second marriage. She's 16, lives in Switzerland. We've met twice. Sophie's expression softened. That sounds lonely. James had never really thought of it as lonely. It was simply how things were. But standing here, fresh from the warmth of Sophie's family gathering, he suddenly recognized the emptiness he'd never acknowledged. It was normal for me, he said finally. My parents were both successful in their fields. My father in finance, my mother in art curation. They raised me to be independent. Independent isn't the same as alone, Sophie said quietly. She reached up, touching his face with a gentleness that made something in his chest ache. Then she stood on tiptoes and kissed him, not the brief, impulsive kiss from the bus stop, but something deeper, more deliberate. James pulled her closer, one hand at her waist, the other tangling in her hair. The world narrowed to just this moment. The softness of her lips, the faint scent of vanilla that clung to her skin, the completeness he felt holding her. When they finally separated, Sophie's eyes remained closed for a moment longer, as if memorizing the feeling. Stay, she whispered, not at your place or mine, just stay here with me a little longer. They ended up walking for hours through Sophie's neighborhood. She showed him the elementary school she'd attended, the corner where she'd learned to ride a bike, the fire escape where she and Rosa had shared secrets as teenagers. James listened, absorbing these pieces of her history, understanding that she was offering him something precious, a map to who she was and how she'd become that person. In return, he found himself sharing things he rarely discussed, his insecurities beneath the successful exterior, his occasional fear that his achievements were never quite enough, his worry that connection had been sacrificed for accomplishment somewhere along the way. When they finally said goodnight, the sky was beginning to lighten with the first hints of dawn. James drove home to his penthouse, feeling both exhausted and exhilarated, like he'd discovered a new continent he hadn't known existed. As he entered his sleek, minimalist apartment, for the first time, it struck him how empty it felt. Not just of people, but of history, of life's beautiful messiness. The pristine countertops held no evidence of family gatherings. The walls displayed expensive art, but no photographs. The refrigerator contained prepared meals, but no containers of lovingly packed leftovers. James set the container from Mrs. Martinez on his kitchen counter, a small splash of warmth in the cool perfection of his home. Something was shifting inside him, a reordering of priorities he hadn't anticipated. His phone buzzed with an early message from Sophie. "Thank you for last night, for seeing my world and wanting to be part of it. See you Sunday." James smiled as he typed his reply, wouldn't miss it for anything. By mid-August, James and Sophie had been dating for nearly 2 months. What had begun as an unexpected connection was deepening into something neither had anticipated. James had become a regular at Sunday family dinners, had mastered the art of folding empanadas under Abuela Elena's watchful eye, and had even helped Miguel fix the store's temperamental refrigeration unit one sweltering afternoon. Today, however, marked a significant shift. Sophie was joining James at a charity gala hosted by one of his major investors. It would be her first real introduction to his world, and James found himself uncharacteristically anxious as he waited in the lobby of her apartment building. When Sophie emerged, James momentarily lost his ability to speak. She wore a simple emerald green dress that hugged her curves before flowing elegantly to the floor. Her usually unruly curls had been partially swept up, with several strands framing her face. She looked beautiful, but also unmistakably herself. No attempt to conform to the polished, airbrushed aesthetic of the social circles they would be entering. "You look incredible," James finally managed. Sophie gave a small, self-conscious twirl. "Rosa helped me find it at a consignment shop. Apparently it was worn once to a diplomat's wedding and then donated." She ran her hands nervously over the fabric. "Is it appropriate?" "It's perfect," James assured her, taking her hand. "You're perfect." In the car, Sophie grew quieter, fidgeting with the small clutch purse she'd borrowed from her cousin. "Nervous?" James asked gently. "Terrified," Sophie admitted with a shaky laugh. "I've never been to anything like this. What if I use the wrong fork or say something inappropriate about wealth inequality to one of your billionaire friends?" "First, they're not all billionaires," James teased. "Some are merely 100 millionaires. And second, just be yourself. That's who I want there with me." Sophie shot him a skeptical look. "Easy for you to say. You were practically raised at events like this, which is precisely why they bore me to tears," James replied. "Having you there will make it bearable." The gala was being held at the city's newly renovated art museum, with the grand marble staircase illuminated by thousands of twinkling lights. As they stepped from the car, photographers captured images of arriving guests. James felt Sophie tense beside him at the unexpected attention. "Just smile and keep walking," he whispered, guiding her with a gentle hand at the small of her back. "They're mostly interested in the celebrities." Near inside, the museum's central hall had been transformed into an elegant reception area, with champagne fountains, ice sculptures, and elaborate floral arrangements. Waitstaff circulated with trays of appetizers that looked more like art installations than food. "Open bar, and they're still charging $5,000 a plate," Sophie murmured, eyeing the ornate surroundings. The children's hospital could have bought a lot of equipment with less extravagant decorations. James suppressed a smile. "Welcome to high society fundraising, where the wealthy ease their consciences by overpaying for rubber chicken while networking. Cynical much?" Sophie raised an eyebrow. Realistic? James countered. But the money does help, even if the methods are imperfect. Me. They had barely made it to the champagne table when James heard his name called. Turning, he saw Melissa, his assistant, approaching with a tall, elegant woman in a designer gown. "James! I was hoping to catch you early," Melissa said. "Ms. Harrington specifically asked to meet you before the dinner portion begins." "Diane Harrington," the woman introduced herself, extending a manicured hand. "Venture Capital, Harrington Partners, your Series C funding round, if you recall." "Of course," James replied smoothly. "Diane, this is Sophie Martinez." Sophie smiled and offered her hand, which Diane shook briefly before returning her attention to James. "I've been following Connectify's expansion into international markets. Very impressive growth metrics this quarter." As the conversation shifted to business, James noticed Sophie gradually being edged out of the circle as more colleagues joined them. He tried several times to include her, but the technical jargon and industry references made it difficult. Eventually, Sophie touched his arm lightly. "I'm going to check out the exhibit in the East Wing," she whispered. "Take your time." Before James could protest, she had slipped away through the crowd. He felt a pang of guilt, but was quickly pulled back into a discussion about potential Asian market partnerships. 20 minutes later, James finally extricated himself and went searching for Sophie. He found her in a quieter gallery, studying a large abstract painting with genuine interest. "I'm sorry about that," he said, coming to stand beside her. "Don't be," Sophie replied, without looking away from the artwork. "That's your world. I get it. They can be overwhelming." "They barely acknowledged I existed," Sophie said matter-of-factly. "The moment they realized I wasn't useful to their business or social ambitions, I became invisible." James couldn't deny it. "Not everyone is like that, but most are." Sophie turned to face him. "It's fine, James, really. I didn't expect to fit in here." Before he could respond, an announcement indicated dinner was being served. As they made their way to the main hall, James introduced Sophie to several more people, some of whom made genuine efforts at conversation, while others barely masked their assessment of her worth to their social ecosystem. At their assigned table, they were seated with the CEO of a competing tech company and his wife, a fashion designer whose celebrity clients regularly appeared on magazine covers, a retired senator and his much younger companion, and a real estate mogul whose developments were rapidly gentrifying several of the city's neighborhoods, including the one where Sophie's family store was located. "Martinez," the real estate developer Robert Keller repeated when introductions were made. "Any relation to Martinez Properties?" "No relation," Sophie replied. "Just a family convenience store on Elmwood Avenue." "Elmwood? That's in the West Side District, isn't it?" Keller's interest seemed to sharpen. "Charming area, lots of potential for revitalization." "It doesn't need revitalizing," Sophie said, her tone polite but firm. "It's a vibrant community with multi-generational businesses and strong neighborhood ties." Of course," Keller nodded dismissively. "But surely you've noticed the aging infrastructure, the outdated storefronts. Our latest project is bringing modern residential units and upscale retail to several blocks just north of Elmwood." "You mean you're pricing out families who've lived there for decades?" Sophie said, her smile tight. A tense silence fell over the table. James placed a hand on Sophie's knee under the table, not to silence her, but in solidarity. "Progress always involves change," Keller said finally. "The area will benefit from the increased property values and new amenities." "Benefit whom, exactly?" Sophie challenged. "Not the elderly residents on fixed incomes or the family-owned businesses that can't afford tripled rent." The fashion designer, Elise, leaned forward with unexpected interest. "She has a point, Robert. Your last revitalization project in Riverdale displaced that amazing Ethiopian restaurant I used to love." "Market forces?" Keller shrugged. "Unavoidable. Market forces shaped by deliberate policy and investment decisions," Sophie countered. "Nothing unavoidable about it." James watched with a mixture of pride and concern as Sophie held her own in the increasingly heated discussion. She was articulate, informed, and passionate, qualities he admired deeply, but he could see Keller growing irritated at being challenged by someone he perceived as beneath his station. The senator's companion, who had remained quiet until now, suddenly spoke up. "I grew up in a neighborhood like the one you're describing," she said to Sophie. "When developers came in, my parents lost the bakery they'd run for 20 years. No one cared about the character we brought to the area until it was marketable to wealthy outsiders." The conversation shifted, with unexpected alliances forming across the table. By the time dessert was served, Sophie had connected with several people who shared her concerns about community preservation, while Keller had retreated into stony silence. After dinner, as they moved to the ballroom for dancing, James pulled Sophie into a quiet alcove. "You were amazing in there," he said, genuine admiration in his voice. "I spoke too much," Sophie sighed. "Your business associate probably hates me now." "Keller's not my associate," James clarified. "And even if he were, I wouldn't care. You spoke the truth, Sophie. That matters more." She studied his face. "Even when it conflicts with your world's interests." "Maybe especially then," James replied. "Besides, did you notice Elise asking for your contact information? She wants to feature local businesses in her next campaign." Sophie's eyes widened. "Seriously? I thought she was just being polite." "Elise doesn't do polite for the sake of it," James laughed. "She meant it." The orchestra began playing a waltz, and James extended his hand with a small bow. "May I have this dance?" Sophie's smile returned as she placed her hand in his. "Lead the way." On the dance floor, James guided her confidently through the steps. Unlike their spontaneous dancing in the park, this was more structured, but Sophie followed his lead with natural grace. "You dance beautifully," he murmured. "Surprised?" Sophie teased. "Continually," James admitted, "in the best possible way." As they moved across the floor, James became aware of curious glances and whispered conversations. His relationship with Sophie had become something of a talking point in his circles. The successful tech CEO dating a convenience store cashier pre-med student from that neighborhood. Some found it charming, others clearly saw it as evidence of a mid-30s crisis. "People are staring," Sophie noted, her voice low. "Let them," James replied, drawing her closer. "They're just jealous I have the most interesting woman in the room." Sophie laughed, the sound cutting through the practiced politeness around them. Smooth talker. Later, as they waited for the valet to bring James's car, Sophie grew quiet again, a thoughtful expression on her face. "What's on your mind?" James asked. "Tonight was illuminating," she said carefully. "I've been thinking about us, about our different worlds." James felt a flash of concern. And I realized something important," Sophie continued. "The divide isn't just economic. It's about values, priorities, how we see the world and our place in it." "Is that a problem?" James asked, his voice tight. Sophie turned to face him fully. "It could be, but it doesn't have to be." She took his hands in hers. "What I saw tonight is that you don't quite fit in your world either, James. Not anymore." The observation struck him with unexpected force. She was right. He had been going through the motions of his usual life, but something fundamental had shifted. The endless networking, the status signaling, the carefully curated relationships, they had begun to feel hollow compared to Sunday dinners with the Martinez family or late-night conversations with Sophie about things that actually mattered. "Maybe I need a new world," he said softly, "or at least a different way of being in this one." The valet pulled up with his car, but neither moved immediately. "What are we doing, James?" Sophie asked, vulnerability clear in her voice. "Is this just an interesting diversion for you? The authentic experience before returning to regular programming?" "Is that what you think?" James asked, genuinely hurt. "I don't know what to think," Sophie admitted. "Tonight I saw how different our lives are. And yet, James prompted when she trailed off, "and yet when you look at me, I feel like you actually see me, not what I represent or what I can do for you, but just me." She took a deep breath. "And that terrifies me, because I'm falling in love with you, and I'm not sure where this can possibly go." The confession hung in the air between them, honest and raw. James felt something break open inside him, a wall he hadn't even realized he'd built around his heart. "Sophie," he said, his voice rough with emotion, "I fell in love with you weeks ago. Probably that first day in the store, if I'm being honest." Her eyes widened. "You never said—" "I was afraid," James admitted. "Not of loving you, but of not being worthy of how real you are. Everything in my life has been about achievement, acquisition, moving forward. You've shown me how to be present, how to connect, how to actually live instead of just succeed." Sophie's eyes glistened with unshed tears. "That's a lot of pressure to put on someone, James." "It's not pressure," he insisted. "It's gratitude. You didn't change me. You just helped me remember who I wanted to be before the world told me who I should be." The valet cleared his throat discreetly, holding the car door open with practiced patience. James tipped him generously as they finally slid into the vehicle. As they drove away from the glittering event, Sophie reached across the console to take James's hand. "So what now?" she asked. "Now," James replied, "we figure out how to build something real between our two worlds, if you're willing." Sophie squeezed his hand, her simple touch a promise. "I'm willing, if you are." The city lights blurred around them as they drove through the night, neither fully of one world or the other anymore, but somewhere new, somewhere of their own making. 4 months after the charity gala, on a crisp December morning, James stood behind the counter of Martinez Minimart, carefully restocking the candy display while Sophie finalized her medical school applications in the small office at the back. "You're putting the chocolate bars in the wrong section," Miguel pointed out, pausing as he mopped the floor. "Aunt Carmen has a system." "I've noticed," James replied dryly. Carmen Martinez's organizational systems were legendary in their complexity, which is why I created this app to help me remember where everything goes. He showed Miguel his phone screen, where he'd designed a simple inventory management application specifically for the store. Miguel whistled appreciatively. "Man, you really are a tech genius. Does my aunt know you did this?" "It was her idea, actually," James admitted. "She mentioned how much time they spend training new employees on the layout, so I offered to help." The bell above the door jingled as an elderly woman entered, her steps slow but determined. "Good morning, Mrs. Abernathy," James greeted her. "The fresh coffee just finished brewing." "Thank you, dear," she replied, making her way to the coffee station. "Is Sophie in today?" "Working on her applications in the back. She'll be out in a minute if you'd like to wait." Mrs. Abernathy nodded, pouring her coffee with shaky hands that James had learned not to offer help with unless specifically requested. "Such a smart girl. She'll make a wonderful doctor." "The best," James agreed, pride evident in his voice. The past few months had brought significant changes to both their lives. James had scaled back his 70-hour work weeks at Connectify, delegating more responsibility to his leadership team. He'd moved from his downtown penthouse to a more modest but still comfortable condo in a mixed-income neighborhood halfway between the financial district and Sophie's family's area. The change had raised eyebrows among his business associates, but had felt right to him, a physical manifestation of his shifting priorities. Sophie had continued her pre-med studies while working at the store and Rosario's, though she'd been able to cut back slightly on her hours. James had offered financial support several times, but Sophie had firmly declined. "I need to do this my way," she'd explained. "I've worked for everything in my life. My independence matters to me." James had respected her decision, though they'd eventually compromised when he established a small scholarship fund through Connectify for students from underserved communities pursuing healthcare careers. Sophie had been one of 10 recipients, selected by an independent committee that James had no influence over, a fact she had verified thoroughly before accepting. "Mr. Harrison, Mrs." Abernathy's voice pulled him from his thoughts. Would you mind reaching that can of soup for me? These old bones don't stretch like they used to." James smiled and retrieved the requested item from the top shelf. As he handed it to her, he noticed Sophie watching from the office doorway, her expression soft. "Application submitted," she announced, joining them at the counter. "Now we wait." "You'll get in," Mrs. Abernathy said confidently. "My Harold always said you had healer's hands. He could tell, you know." Sophie squeezed the older woman's shoulder gently. "I hope he was right." After Mrs. Abernathy had paid for her items and left, Sophie leaned against the counter beside James. "So that's it," she said, a mixture of relief and anxiety in her voice. 6 applications to medical schools. Now the universe decides. The universe and admissions committees," James corrected with a smile. "And they'd be fools not to accept you." The bell jingled again as Eduardo and Carmen Martinez entered, arms laden with grocery bags. "Supplies for Sunday dinner," Carmen explained, setting her bags on the counter. "James, you're still coming, yes?" "I'm making my special paella." "I wouldn't miss it," James assured her. Over the past months, Sunday dinners had become sacred to him. The boisterous conversations, the multiple generations crowded around tables pushed together, the sense of belonging he'd never experienced in his own family. He'd even started bringing his half-sister Eliza when she visited from Switzerland during school breaks, watching with satisfaction as the Martinez family folded her into their warmth without hesitation. "Good, good," Carmen nodded. "Eduardo, tell him the news." Eduardo finished arranging some items on a shelf before turning with a proud smile. "The bank approved our loan application. We can begin renovations next month." "That's fantastic!" James exclaimed, genuinely thrilled. The renovations were actually a significant expansion. The convenience store was purchasing the vacant space next door to create a small cafe section featuring Carmen's cooking and a community meeting area. The plan had been Eduardo's dream for years, but financing had always been an obstacle until recently. James had initially offered to invest, but Eduardo had politely declined, preferring to maintain full family ownership. Instead, James had connected them with a community development bank that specialized in loans to local businesses and had helped refine their business plan to strengthen their application. "We'll need your expertise with the technology setup," Eduardo added. "The point-of-sale system, inventory management, all of that." "Happy to help," James replied. The shift in their relationship had been gradual but meaningful, from Sophie's boyfriend to a valued advisor and increasingly something like family. As Sophie and her parents discussed renovation details, James's phone buzzed with an email notification. Glancing at the screen, he saw it was from his lawyer, confirming that the paperwork was ready for his latest project. 6 weeks earlier, James had surprised his board of directors by announcing the creation of a new division within Connectify focused on developing affordable technology solutions for small businesses in underserved communities. The initiative would provide inventory management systems, customer relationship tools, and digital marketing support at heavily subsidized rates, along with training programs to help traditional businesses compete in the digital economy. The idea had been born from his experiences at Martinez Minimart, watching a successful family business struggle with outdated systems while competing against chain stores with sophisticated technology. His board had been skeptical at first, but James had convinced them of both the social impact and the long-term business benefits of supporting the small business ecosystem. "What are you smiling about?" Sophie asked, coming to stand beside him. "Just thinking about how much has changed since I first walked in here looking for a phone to call roadside assistance," James replied, slipping an arm around her waist. "Who would have thought a broken-down Tesla would lead to all this?" Sophie mused. "Speaking of which," Eduardo called from the stockroom, "that fancy electric car of yours isn't blocking our delivery entrance today, is it?" "I drove the hybrid," James laughed. The good-natured teasing about his formerly flashy lifestyle had become a running joke. Later that afternoon, as the winter sun began to set early, James and Sophie walked hand in hand through the neighborhood. They'd fallen into the habit of these walks, Sophie pointing out changes in the community, James increasingly recognizing faces and being recognized in return. Mrs. Diaz's son found a new job, Sophie mentioned, as they passed an apartment building. Better pay, benefits, actual career path. He's with that tech company that partners with community colleges for recruitment. TechBridge, James asked. They're doing impressive work. The same program your company just donated to, if I remember correctly, Sophie said, giving him a knowing look. James shrugged, but couldn't hide his smile. His philanthropy had become more targeted over recent months, focusing on organizations directly benefiting communities like Sophie's. They stopped at a small playground where children were enjoying the last hour of daylight. Taking seats on a bench, they watched a group of kids organizing an elaborate game with rules only they seemed to understand. "I got another acquisition offer yesterday," James said after a comfortable silence. "Bigger than the last one." Sophie turned to look at him. "Are you considering it?" "No," James replied without hesitation. "Connectify is doing important work now, especially with the new community initiative. I'm not interested in having some tech giant dismantle that or turn it into a tax write-off." Sophie nodded, studying his face. "You've changed. For the better, I hope." "Definitely for the better," she confirmed. "You were a good man when I met you, James. But now you're more present, connected, not just to me, but to everything around you." James considered this. "I think I was sleepwalking before. Success became this narrow path I was following without looking around to see what else might matter. And now? Now I understand that success means nothing if it's not connected to actual people, actual communities." He squeezed her hand. "You taught me that. You and your family." Sophie leaned against his shoulder. "We didn't teach you anything you didn't already know somewhere inside. We just reminded you." They sat quietly for a few minutes, watching the children play. James found himself thinking about the future, not in terms of business milestones or acquisitions as he once had, but in terms of moments like this. Presence, connection, purpose. "I have something for you," he said finally, reaching into his jacket pocket. "An early Christmas gift." Sophie raised an eyebrow. "We agreed on no expensive presents." "It didn't cost anything," James assured her, pulling out a small envelope and handing it to her. Sophie opened it curiously, removing a simple key. "What's this?" "A key to my condo," James explained. "I'm not asking you to move in. I know you value your independence and want to stay close to your family, but I wanted you to have it, so you can come and go as you please, so you know you're always welcome in my space, just as I've been welcomed in yours." Sophie turned the key over in her palm, her expression thoughtful. "It's a big step." "It is," James agreed. "But we've been taking big steps since the day we met." Sophie closed her fingers around the key and leaned in to kiss him softly. "Thank you. It means a lot." As they continued their walk, eventually circling back toward the store, James felt a deep contentment that no business success had ever provided. The neighborhood had begun to feel like home, in a way his luxury penthouse never had, full of stories, connections, and genuine human interaction. "Oh, I meant to tell you," Sophie said as they approached the store. "My study group wants to meet at your place next week, if that's okay. My apartment is too small, and the library's always booked during finals." "Of course," James replied. "I'll make myself scarce." "Actually," Sophie said hesitantly, "they asked if you'd join us. Apparently having a tech CEO who tutored organic chemistry at Stanford could be useful." She made air quotes around the last word. James laughed. "Happy to help. Just don't tell them I barely passed the final exam." "Your secret's safe with me," Sophie promised, her eyes dancing with amusement. Back at the store, Eduardo was locking up for the evening. "Perfect timing," he called to them. "Sophie, your mother says to bring James for dinner tonight. She's testing new recipes for the cafe menu and needs honest opinions." "We'll be there," Sophie confirmed. As her father walked toward their family apartment above the store, she turned to James. "Unless you have other plans." I know it was a last-minute invitation. No place I'd rather be, James said truthfully. Sophie smiled, standing on tiptoes to kiss him quickly. Let me grab my things from inside. As James waited outside, he gazed at the modest storefront of Martinez Minimart. The sign needed repainting, and the building itself was overdue for renovation, but to him it had become one of the most important places in the city. The place where his life had changed course with a simple request to use a phone. Sophie emerged with her backpack slung over one shoulder. Ready? Actually, James said. Can we make a quick stop first? I need to pick something up. Sophie looked puzzled but nodded. Sure. Where? James took her hand, a mischievous smile playing on his lips. I need to buy a bottle of water. Understanding dawned on Sophie's face, followed by laughter, bright and clear in the evening air. Just water, please, she quoted from their first meeting. The most important purchase I ever made, James replied, pulling her close. As they walked toward their future together, James reflected on how a broken-down car and a bottle of overpriced water had led him to the most authentic connection of his life. His world had expanded in ways he never could have anticipated, becoming richer, more meaningful, and infinitely more real. And it had all begun with just water.